The first time I saw her marching up my gravel driveway in those stiff, pressed beige slacks and oversized sunglasses that looked like they cost more than my first truck, I just knew the peace and quiet of my mountain morning was officially over. And not because I'd actually done anything wrong, but because in a place like Blackwood Ridge, daring to build something without kissing the ring of the local powers that be is considered high crime. She was waving a manila folder like it was a holy relic or maybe a court summons, her face set in that permanent scowl of someone who has made professional meddling her only personality trait. And before she even reached the porch, she called out in this high, nasal tone that echoed off the pines, telling me I couldn't and oppose. Just throw up a shack and call a cabin because it was a clear violation of HOA Code Section 14.2. Her name was Evelyn Vance, and she was exactly the kind of person you'd expect to chair an architectural review committee. Middle-aged, dangerously overconfident, and completely obsessed with enforcing a level of control she didn't actually possess over people who just wanted to be left alone. I remember leaning against the cedar railing of the cabin I'd spent the last 6 months pouring my soul into, just taking a slow sip of coffee and watching her approach, thinking about how she'd once issued a formal warning to my neighbor, a quiet guy named Silas, for having too many decorative rocks in his yard when the poor man only had 4. I stayed calm, letting the mountain air settle my nerves while she stood there fuming at the base of my steps. And I just told her flat out that this was private land and the HOA didn't oppose to extend this far back into the woods. But she didn't oppose to even blink. She just flipped through her papers with this smug little smirk and told me that as of the latest boundary amendment, my entire parcel had been brought within their expanded jurisdiction. She claimed I'd been sent a letter, which was news to me since my mailbox had been empty of anything but hardware flyers for weeks. And then she pointed to my cabin like it had personally insulted her ancestors, calling it a non-permitted eyesore that didn't oppose match the established character of the neighborhood, and she actually had the nerve to say the whole thing might need to be torn down. I took another long, slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth of the mug against my palms while I looked her dead in the eye and asked if she was absolutely sure she wanted to go down this road. But she just crossed her arms and stood her ground with this look of absolute authority that made me almost feel sorry for her. I reached into the weatherproof mailbox I'd mounted right next to the front door, pulled out a laminated document I'd kept ready for just such an occasion, and walked down the steps to hand it to her, watching her eyes scan the page until they hit the signature at the bottom and then suddenly widened behind those expensive lenses. Her voice actually cracked when she asked why the document said I'd approved the structure myself, and I couldn't oppose. Helped but grin just a little bit when I told her that my name is Elias Thorne and I'd been appointed to the county zoning and land use board just last month. The way her jaw dropped reminded me of a fish gasping for air on a dry dock, especially when I pointed out that this land was never legally part of her HOA until that shady, backroom boundary expansion she'd pushed through last week. An expansion that, by the way, was already under formal review by the county council for massive procedural violations. I told her the cabin was fully permitted, signed off by the highest authority in the county after every legal and environmental check in the book, and that if she didn't oppose, get off my property right that second. The next piece of paper I handed her wouldn't oppose be a permit. It would be a trespass notice served by the sheriff. She didn't oppose say another word. She just turned on her heel and stomped back down the gravel, her designer shoes crunching like angry little beetles, and I watched her go while thinking about how some people spend their lives building walls of red tape, while I preferred building something that actually lasted. But of course, a woman like Evelyn doesn't oppose. Just go away. She's the kind of person who sees as a personal challenge to her existence. And 3 days later, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulled into my main driveway, parking just inches from my garage like they own the place. I was out back near the creek, working on some motion sensor lighting for the trail, and I took my sweet time walking up to meet them because I've learned that nobody who shows up unannounced in a vehicle like that is ever bringing good news. Standing there was a man in a tailored fleece vest and loafers that had never seen a speck of mountain dirt, flipping through a leather-bound notebook, and beside him was a woman named Sarah Jenkins, the HOA secretary, who wore a gold-plated badge clipped to her blouse like she was a deputy U.S. Marshal instead of a glorified neighborhood snitch. The man introduced himself as Julian Vane, the HOA's legal counsel, and he didn't oppose. To even bother to offer a handshake, he just started lecturing me about, in quote, architectural conformity, in quote, and how my cabin was a visual blight that didn't oppose. T matched the upscale aesthetic they were trying to cultivate. I just laughed, a short, sharp sound that didn't oppose. T have any humor in it, and told him it was rich hearing about aesthetics from a board that ignored the 5 houses down the road with blue tarps stapled to their roofs for the last 2 winters. Sarah stepped forward then, her face tight with a kind of righteous fury, and told me they were officially fining me $5,000 plus $1,000 for every day the cabin remained standing, but I just reached into the crate on my porch and handed Julian a sealed envelope I'd prepared that morning. He opened it, his jaw twitching as he read the first few lines, and I explained that it was a formal cease and desist filed with the county clerk, referencing their unlawful attempt to annex private parcels through fraudulent misfilings. And I promised him that if they tried to collect a single dime, I would file an injunction that would tie their HOA up in court until his loafers went out of style. The tension in the air was so thick you could have cut it with a chainsaw, and Julian took a slow, controlled breath before folding the letter and tucking it away, muttering something about reviewing it with his team, but I wasn't oppose. Done yet. I told them they might want to look at their own meeting minutes from last month, specifically the vote for the boundary expansion, because 2 of the board members who signed off on it didn't oppose. Even legally reside in Blackwood Ridge full-time, which made their ballots, and the entire amendment completely invalid. Sarah's expression finally cracked, a flicker of genuine panic crossing her eyes before they hurried back to their SUV and sped off, leaving a cloud of dust that felt like a temporary victory. But my gut told me there was something much bigger than a cabin design at play here. That evening, I drove into town to the county records office and met with Lenora, a retired teacher who'd been the clerk there since before I was born, and she handed me a folder thick enough to be a phone book, telling me the HOA had just dumped 50 pages of, in quote, urgent, in quote, supplemental filings that morning. As I flipped through the redacted notes and hastily typed amendments, something caught my eye, an email chain that had accidentally been included in the discovery pile between the HOA president and a major regional developer. My heart sank as I read the details of a plan to build a massive luxury complex called, in quote, the Cascades, in quote, just beyond a ravine. But there was a catch. The developer needed a specific land bridge and access rights that only my property and a few others provided. The, in quote, boundary expansion, in quote, wasn't oppose about architectural standards at all. It was a coordinated land grab designed to absorb our private parcels, force us into compliance, and then sell the access rights to the developer for a massive payout that would go straight into the board's private reserve fund. I sat there in that quiet office, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead feeling like a buzzing hornet's nest in my brain, realizing that they weren't oppose. Just trying to bully me. They were trying to erase my property rights entirely. I took high-resolution photos of every single page, every signature, and every incriminating timestamp, and then I made a call to an old friend named Marcus who I hadn't oppose. Spoken to in years, a man who worked deep within the state's fraud division. When he heard my voice, he joked that I must be running for office, but his tone shifted instantly when I told him I had evidence of a coordinated attempt to manipulate property access through fraudulent HOA. Expansion and shell company kickbacks. He told me to bring everything in immediately, and by the time I reached the state office, it was well after dark, but Marcus was waiting in a side conference room with a pot of coffee and a look of grim determination. We spent hours laying the documents out on the table, connecting the dots between Julian Vane's law firm, the developer's offshore accounts, and the HOA board's illegal voting records, and Marcus confirmed my worst fears. This wasn't oppose. Just unethical. It was criminal mail fraud, wire fraud, and a conspiracy to commit real estate theft on a massive scale. He promised me they'd issue subpoenas by the end of the week, telling me that when these big developers get caught in a paper trail this dirty, they usually fold faster than a cheap lawn chair to save their own skins. The next morning, I was back on my porch, watching the sun crest over the pines and feeling a strange sense of calm. even as I saw a small crowd of board members gathering across the street, pacing and whispering in frantic circles. Sarah Jenkins was there, looking like she hadn't an oppos. T slept a wink, but Evelyn Vance was nowhere to be found. And a few hours later, a sheriff's cruiser pulled into the HOA's gravel lot with a quiet, firm authority that signaled the beginning of the end. By sunset, the neighborhood group chat, which was usually just people complaining about trash pickup, was exploding with photos of investigators carrying filing cabinets out of the HOA office, and the panic among the board's loyalists was spreading like wildfire. My neighbor Silas, the guy with the rocks, walked up my driveway with a six-pack and a look of pure awe, telling me he'd never seen anyone actually stand up to them like that. And I just told him that I didn't and oppose. To go to war with them, I just made sure the truth had better lawyers. We sat there in the cooling air, watching the stars come out, and for the first time in weeks, there was no one hovering over me with a clipboard or a threat, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the slow, satisfying unraveling of a scheme that was too rotten to survive the light of day. But as the days went by, the fallout became even more explosive because it turned out the HOA president, a man named Sterling Vance, Evelyn's husband, had disappeared along with $400,000 from the community's emergency reserve fund. Federal agents showed up at my door a few days later, showing me photos of Sterling shaking hands with the developer at a private golf club 3 states away, and they revealed that the money meant for our neighborhood's drainage repairs had been used to bankroll the developer's initial permits. I felt a pit in my stomach realizing how close we'd come to losing everything, but the community was and oppos, crumbling. It was finally waking up, and we organized a meeting at the Park Pavilion to form a provisional council that was actually transparent and accountable. We didn't and oppose. T wanted a new HOA with new badges and new rules. We wanted a neighborly agreement to look out for each other. And when the news broke that Sterling had been arrested in a hotel near Reno with a briefcase full of burner phones and cash, the last of the old board's influence vanished overnight. Evelyn Vance moved out under the cover of darkness, leaving behind a, and quote, "Bless this home," and quote, sign that someone took down and tossed in the bin before noon the next day, and the county officially voided every single amendment they'd passed in the last year. Life has finally returned to a version of normal, but it's a better kind of normal where people actually stop to talk to each other instead of just nodding or checking for lawn violations, and the air feels lighter, like a weight has been lifted off the entire mountain. Silas and I actually spent last weekend building a small pedestrian bridge over the creek, connecting our properties so we can share tools and stories without having to walk all the way around the road. And we didn't in oppos. T asked for permission. We didn't in oppos. T filed a design review. And we certainly didn't in oppos. T checked the color of the wood against a pre-approved palette. We just built it because it was useful. And as I stand on that bridge now, listening to the water rush beneath the solid cedar planks, I realize that the most important thing you can ever build ISN and oppos. A cabin or a bridge. It's the courage to stand your ground when people try to tell you that your own life belongs to them. But it makes me wonder, looking at all the other neighborhoods out there, how many other, in quote, Evelyn's, in quote, are currently sitting in wood-paneled offices, moving lines on a map and hoping no one notices the fine print? If your neighborhood started changing the rules behind closed doors, would you have the paper trail ready to stop them, or would you just let them tear down what you've built? Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to deal with a power tripping board, or if you think I went too far by involving the feds. I'd love to hear your thoughts on where the line should be drawn between community standards and personal freedom.